Please open mind. Discern this in all information. April 18, 2016. Benjamin Fulford. Red and Green Asian secret societies under new leadership promise to make the earth tremble. Last week a representative claiming to be from the head family of the Hungmen Worldwide Chinese Union informed the White Dragon Society that the Red and Green were under new leadership. He said, "When the Asian giant moves, the earth will shake, but our goal is world peace." Not much more can be written about the Red and Blue NWD's talks, however. You can be sure big events will unfold soon. There is also a lot of chatter from multiple sources including the CIA and the Pentagon that some sort of financial event far bigger than the Lehman shock is imminent. While experience has taught us to be wary of specific dates, many sources even go so far as to say it will be on April 19. This is the day the Shanghai Gold Exchange will start its gold trading platform intended to take over setting the gold price from the Hazarian mafia-controlled banks. It is probably no coincidence then that last week Deutsche Bank admitted in court that it manipulated gold and silver prices and promised to release all the information it has about other big banks involved in the price manipulation. So, we have the Chinese starting a gold exchange at the same time as the Western banks that traditionally set the gold price are being publicly outed for fraud. The Shanghai Gold Exchange will also make it possible for the Asians to monetize the vast off-market gold hoards they reportedly hold. This means the Chinese yuan will become at least partially gold-backed. This is the probable source of reports such as this one that claim China will announce it will launch an international gold-backed yuan and stop accepting US dollars starting this week. We have not been able to independently confirm this, but can say the WDs has advised the Chinese to make such a move in coordination with the US military and agencies. Certainly the finance ministers and top central bankers form the G20 nations were all gathered in Washington last week for both regularly scheduled and emergency meetings. The Federal Reserve Board governors also had a lot of emergency meetings. One visible result was historically significant news last week about the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation telling banking giants like J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, New York Mellon Bank and State Street Corp that their bankruptcy plans were not credible. To put it another way, some of the top Hazarian cabal banks and owners of the Federal Reserve Board are basically being told they are de facto bankrupt. Pentagon sources and CIA sources both also tell us that when Federal Reserve Board Chairperson Janet Yellen met with U.S. President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden that Yellen asked for the U.S. military to mobilize to round up troublemakers and put them in FEMA camps to prevent mass rioting after a planned Fed move to save the big banks by stealing people's savings. Let the dollar die and do a bail-in, is how the CIA source summed up Yellen's proposal. In any case, the military said no, they had other plans. Yellen should have taken the gold deal offered to her last week by the Asians while she had the chance. Instead, the military have now forced Yellen to get the Fed to send and publish letter to J.P. Morgan to let the world know that it is unstable. Military pressure was also behind the FDIC warning to the big five banks mentioned above. As a result, Wells Fargo and other banks have begun training staff for an emergency scenario. The U.S. military is also actively working to create a new government-issued U.S. dollar backed with silver and Asian gold to keep the U.S. economy running after the collapse of the Hazarian Mafia's Babylonian debt slavery banking system, WD's sources say. The situation is not much better in Europe. The IMF publicly stated last week the European banks have €900 billion worth of bad debt and that they could no longer postpone dealing with it. It is a pretty good guess the real bad debt numbers are far worse than what the IMF is willing to admit. In other words, many of the top European banks are also probably bankrupt. Barclays, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, and UBS are being scrutinized by regulators to see if they are solvent, Russian sources say. This may be why the Hazarian mafia oligarchs have suddenly launched campaigns in the US and Europe to close offshore tax havens and force or lure the world's $31 trillion in offshore money into Europe or the US, where they can confiscate it and stave off bankruptcy. CIA sources say the Rothschilds have already managed to lure trillions of dollars into Reno, Nevada with this cockroach motel scam. You can be sure it is not their own offshore money they plan to repatriate. Some money that is sure to be confiscated is Saudi Arabia's US dollar-denominated holdings. Last week there were corporate propaganda media reports that Saudi Arabia would sell off hundreds of billions of dollars worth of its US assets and treasury bonds if the US government released the 28 secret pages of the 9/11 report, or if it allowed families of victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia. However, Saudi Arabia does not have that choice and instead will find out that its US holdings have already been confiscated. Even with Turkish and Israeli help, the US and Russia could crush them like bugs if they object to such a confiscation. In fact, according to Pentagon sources, President Obama will be visiting Saudi Arabia this week to read them the Riot Act and force them to stop their troublemaking around the world. Furthermore, Obama will release the 28 pages after he returns from the visit, the sources say. At the same time as Obama visits Saudi Arabia, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been summoned to Moscow. There he will be told to return the Golan Heights to Syria and comply with other UN resolutions concerning Israel, or else it will be faced with sanctions, and that all options will be on the table. This could mean a full blockade of Israel. Furthermore, the sources say Obama, backed by the US military, will not use the customary US veto to save Israel from UN sanctions. The Russians will also be asking for the return of gold stolen from the Tsar of Russia by the Rothschild family, the real rulers of Israel, the sources say. The Bank of Japan Library has a report about Japanese warships arriving in Vladivostok in 1918 to evacuate 10 tons of the Tsar's gold before the communists could get a hold of it. This gold was later shipped to London, according to the BOJ. This is probably just the tip of the missing Russian gold iceberg. Speaking about stolen gold, there is a flurry of activity going on in connection with gold stashes in Indonesia. This week Indonesian President Joko Widodo, Jokowi, is visiting Germany, the UK, Belgium, and Holland to discuss the Indonesian gold among other things. It turns out the gold was brought over by the Japanese, meaning that it was taken from other Asian countries who are now claiming the rights to it, CIA sources in Indonesia say. The Europeans also lust after this gold. Photographs of the Indonesian gold site can be made available to interested parties, the sources say. In any case, at the end of the day, it will probably take a deal between the Pentagon White Hats, WDs, and the Chinese to sort this out. A public sign the US White Hats and the Chinese are already reaching deals can be confirmed by the fact that last week the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the US-controlled World Bank announced their first jointly financed project. The next step is to ramp up the scale of investments from the billions to the trillions of dollars. Another deal being worked out between the WDs and the Chinese concerns Japan. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who ultimately reports to the Agnelli brothers and Evelyn de Rothschild, needs to go, the two sides agree. The Chinese had been pushing for long-term politician and power broker Ichiro Ozawa, but he was too anti-American for Pentagon tastes, sources involved in the negotiations say. For that reason Hideo Higashikokubaru, a TV talent and former governor of Miyazaki Prefecture, is being considered as Abe's replacement, the sources say. Higashikokubaru would preside over a jubilee and a redistribution of assets, they say. The other development is that Japan is now preparing to fully legalize marijuana and give control of the resulting business bonanza to Asian secret societies. Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, meanwhile, is planning to be a major player in the medical marijuana industry, Asian secret society sources say. While on the subject of Japan, the earthquake last week in southern Japan appears, from seismographic and other evidence, to have been a natural one. The volcanic ring of fire around the Pacific Basin is very active because a new continent is being born in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, according to P2 Freemason Lodge sources. This will not happen overnight of course, but already new islands are being born in the region. Thanks for listening and watching. Subscribe and share.